She completed her MSc in 2020, which was focused on the impacts of agriculture on wood turtles. She currently works as a species at risk biologist with the Department of Natural Resources and Energy Development. Thank you, Shaylyn. It is all yours. Oh, thank you for giving us this presentation, and welcome. Nice to have you. All yours.
Awesome. Thank you. Okay, I will share my screen. Can you see my screen?
Okay.
Yep. Okay. Great. Yeah, so as Peter said, I am a species at risk biologist with the Department of Natural Resources and Energy Development. But a lot of what I'm talking about today isn't what my work is now. Pretty much all of the amphibians that we have are common on the landscape, at least for now they are. But amphibians and reptiles are great species to look for and find, and I love looking for them. So so I'm going to talk to you guys today about the amphibians that we have in the province and help to ID them by look and by sound for some of them, talk about the habitats you'll find them in, and then just some interesting facts. So I'm just going to start off with the basics here and just go into what an amphibian is. So I'm sure most of you guys know that these guys are cold-blooded, amphibians are, and what that means is that they just cannot regulate their temperature on their own. So they have to bask if they want to get warm, or go into shade if they want to cool down. Same with reptiles, they also have to do that. Amphibian actually means dual life. So amphi means dual and bian means life. And it's because they have this life cycle partially in the water and then partially on land. And that's not technically true for all amphibians, but for majority of them, that's how it goes. So obviously with this life cycle of a frog, them laying their eggs in the water, tadpoles also in the water. And then when they come out to become a froglet or tadpole frog, they're out onto land, so dual life. And amphibians are also great ecological indicators, and that's mainly because they breathe through their skin. So if there's any toxins in that environment and they're absorbing it, normally that's an indicator that something is not right. So in New Brunswick, amphibians are a much easier species to ID because we don't have that many in New Brunswick. I'm sure this is different for BC, but in New Brunswick, we don't have as many species. So compared to birding, this is actually quite easy if you know what you're looking for. So we have 6 species of salamanders in the province. We have 1 newt, we have 8 frogs, and we have 1 toad. So I'm going to go through all of these and I help you identify them and key things to look for. So I'll start with salamanders. So the first one here is the blue spotted salamander, and a lot of these are like what their name suggests. They have blue spots. As you can see, they have that dark blue outside, which kind of looks black, and then they have this light blue spotting, more so blue on the belly. These guys spend a lot of time underground, or a lot of time under logs or rocks. They like to be in damp areas. I normally see these guys closer to wetlands. Whenever you're flipping over rocks, they're kind of a secret type of salamander. They're a little bit larger. They're 5.5 inches long. And I just wanted to note here, this happens with pretty much all of the salamanders as a defense mechanism. If they feel threatened, they will drop their tail or they'll play dead to deter predators. So if you ever pick one up, the tail, they're likely going to drop that tail, meaning like it's removed from their body, and then they'll have to grow another one. So it takes quite a bit of energy for them to do that, but it's a way for them to get away. So that's not just specifically to blue spotteds, that's for pretty sure all of them. But yes, that's one of the defense mechanisms for these guys. Next, we have the spotted salamander. So another spotted guy. They have these yellow spots. They can sometimes be a little bit orange. These guys will live in dens that other animals leave behind. They are normally in hardwood or mixed forests, and they're closer to water sources, so a lake or a pond. I've heard a lot of people say that they'll find these guys in their sheds or their greenhouses. They normally like to be in those areas. This is the largest of the salamanders. They'll grow up to about 8 inches in length. And I also wanted to say for these spots, you can see that they're irregular. They're kind of misplaced on their body. And a lot of salamander species, this pattern placement is unique to every individual. So if you took a picture of those spots and you looked at that, and then you somehow ran into that salamander again, if you compared photos, you'd be able to see that those spots are in the same place. And so that's unique. That happens with some frog species as well, which I'll talk about. But that's a common study with salamanders, is instead of you doing toe clipping or anything for some of the studies to figure out if you have the same individual, some researchers will just take a photo of their back or their belly, and they can tell, kind of like what you do with whale tails. Taking photos of the whale tail, you can see a unique pattern to identify a unique individual. So that can happen also with salamanders. Next, we have the red-backed salamander. Again, as its name suggests, it has this red stripe along their back. These guys like to be in more mature woodlands, and they also like to be under fallen logs or coarse-weighted debris. Normally, if you're in, I find a lot of my examples I'm maybe thinking about is in Fredericton at Odell Park, going through those woods. If you were flipping up logs and rocks along that trail, you're likely going to find these guys. They're also the most abundant vertebrate on the landscape, so this one's probably the one you're going to see the most. They're also a little bit smaller. These guys are 2 inches in length. I was just thinking, and another thing I just wanted to bring up about salamanders is that there used to be a myth for salamanders that salamanders were born from fire, and that myth was because folks were using logs, placing them on the fire, and then whenever they started it, salamanders would come running out. And it was obviously because salamanders were hiding underneath those logs, and so whenever they moved it onto the fire, obviously the salamanders were running away from the fire. But it was a myth for a while that salamanders actually were born from fire. Next, we have the northern dusky salamander. For these guys, they could be confused with a few species, depending on what you're looking at. Maybe the redback salamander, depending on the color. These guys can have yellowish, gray, brown coloring. If they're wet, they're going to be very dark, and sometimes it might be harder to tell what species this is. The biggest thing here, which I don't know if actually you guys can see my mouse. Can you see my arrow?
Yes. Sorry?
I'm just gonna make it, yeah. So for this guy, it's this white line that goes from its eye to its jaw. I know it's very small, so if you're picking up a salamander or seeing one, I'm sure it's going to be a little bit hard to tell. But it is this very light line that goes from the eye to the jaw. That's the biggest one. And also their hind legs are a lot larger than their front. But again, if you don't have a salamander to be comparing against and you're not seeing them all the time, it really is this line. But it also does not have a red back. But I'm sure sometimes when you look at these species, you might think it potentially could be one or the other. And if you're running into that problem, it would be looking at this line here. These guys can be 5.5 inches in length, so they're bigger than a redback salamander. These ones are mostly found on land, but they can also be close to small groundwater fed streams or seeps. So as I was saying, if they're wet, if they're in water, you're likely going to see a darker coloration. I also want to note with these guys that northern dusky salamander is actually quite rare in other provinces. Here, it's considered common. But whenever herpetologists from Ontario or other provinces come to visit, there's a herpetology conference that happens every year, and they came to Fredericton a couple years ago, and everyone was so excited to see the northern dusky salamander because they're so rare in other places. It's pretty common to see these guys again in Odell. Not sure where it is in Miramichi, but at the top of Odell Park, you can find these guys. Next up is a four-toed salamander. So I said how none of our amphibian species in the province are technically a species at risk, but this is actually the rarest. And I think it's a little bit uncertain on how rare it is, but right now we actually only know of 2 locations in New Brunswick. When I gave this presentation to the Hampton Nature Club a few years ago, we actually had 1. And it was kind of considered, do we even have this species in the province, because there wasn't a lot of observations, but we just got our second one. I think last year or the year before, a student was studying the redback salamander and found this guy outside of Moncton. So they're around. It might be that we just don't understand its habitats, or we're not looking correctly for them, but we do have four-toed salamander. So it's technically called ranked at S1. So it is rare. It's just technically not a species at risk. So these guys are about 4 inches long. They're the only land living salamander with 4 toes on the back feet. So normally salamanders will have 4 toes on the front, 5 on the back, but this is the one that has 4 on the back feet. So that's the biggest tell on what species, if it's a 4-toed salamander, because it has 4 toes. These guys thanks magnum bogs based in streams, and floodplains and woodland areas. Next up, we have the northern two-line salamander. So potential to get confused with the redback. Their color can go yellowish to olive stripes, and they have this black stripe that goes down, bordered by the 2 black lines there. So that's the biggest thing. The redback salamander isn't going to have these 2 lines on the edge of their back, whereas the northern two-line salamander is. These guys are nocturnal, and again, these ones live close to streams. Okay, so that was all of our salamanders. I went through that actually pretty quick. The next one is the red-spotted newt. And I just wanted to actually just show you guys the life cycle first before I explained how to identify these guys. So for the red-spotted newt, their life cycle is actually pretty unique. And this is we only have 1 newt species in the province. And so these guys have this dual life, but they come back to the water. So they have their eggs in the water, they have larvae in the water, they spend that part of their life stage there. Then they actually go on land where they're a juvenile or eft, and they stay up there. And then whenever they become adults, they actually go back to the water. They have a new life stage where they go back to the water, and then they start reproducing and having eggs again. So it's a very unique life cycle. We start in the water, we go to land, and then they come back to the water in the end. So identification's a little bit different with these ones. As you can see in this adult stage, they're very spotted, and they look like a tadpole-like when they're in the water. Whereas the juvenile up here, he's actually more orange, which is what I'm going to actually show you is their life stage that's on land. So that larvae that we had, those ones are olive colored skin, and they have those gills. And then the juvenile here, which is on the left, very bright orange, with those red spots. They have the black border on the outside, and they have rough skin. In comparison to a salamander has smooth skin and a round tail, whereas a newt is going to have rough skin, and they're going to have a more flattened tail. And then the adults, when they go into the water, those guys look olive green with the black bordered spots, and they end up having smooth skin when they go back into the water. So quite a unique stage. I've actually never seen a newt before. I would love to see one because they're very pretty species, but just the one species in the province. So that is what I have for the salamanders and the newts. And now I'm going to go into our frogs and our toad. So I'm just going to quickly go into what the difference between a frog and a toad is. And as I was saying, we actually only have 1 species of toad in the province and actually in Atlantic. So some key differences here between frogs and toads. Hind legs. So frogs have very powerful jumping legs. They can go far, they're long, and they have these webbed feet. I'm sure if you try and catch a frog, normally they can go quite far. It's harder to catch them. Whereas for toads, they have shorter legs for walking and hopping. If you ever came up across a toad, it's quite easy to catch a toad. They don't go very far. They really are walking and hopping. They're not very fast. And most of these toads do not have webbed feet. For eggs, the frogs will lay their eggs in clusters in the water, whereas toads will lay their eggs in a chain. For skin, kind of similar to this difference between newts and salamanders, frogs have moist and smooth skin, whereas toads have dry and bumpy skin. And it's a myth about warts. I'm giving you warts. It doesn't happen, although I'll go into a little bit about they do secrete a little bit of a toxin, but they don't have warts. For habitat, frogs are normally in those moist environments, so closer to wetlands, lakes, ponds, etc. Whereas toads are more so in dry environments, but they can adapt. You can find them in a lot of places, but normally you find them in dry environments. I normally see them when, again, I'm like hiking in a forested area, hardwoods, mixed woods, etc. And that's normally where I would see a toad. So let's go into the differences of the frogs, which I think these ones are probably the most confusing. Salamanders can normally be easy depending on what you're looking at, but the frogs, a lot of them are in the same types of environments. You get multiple species in one pond or lake, and it can be a little bit trickier. So for the mink frog, these guys can grow up to 2 to 3 inches, very aquatic, going to be in the water bodies. They produce a stinky, musty odor when disturbed or threatened. And so their call sounds like a hammer tapping on wood. So I'm going to play you the song. Hopefully my sound's back working again so you guys can hear it. So sounds like it's hammers tapping on wood. Could you hear that?
Yeah.
It almost sounded like whippoorwill in the background. Yeah. That's what kind of threw me off, at least.
Are you playing again?
Yeah, we're probably going to get multiple sounds in here. We're probably also going to get multiple frogs in one call, actually. We'll probably get multiple in some of these, but yeah, good point. So to ID these guys, so this one can be confused with the pickerel frog, the leopard frog, and potentially green frog, honestly, depending on what the coloration is. So there's some key things to keep in mind. So for this one, there's no ridges along the back. You're going to see that for a couple of the other frogs with the ridges, and they have a yellowing stomach. Their spots can be olive to brown, and they have the molting on the sides of the legs. So it's really this biggest one is there's no ridges, and they have this yellowing stomach. That's going to be some key features on how to identify it from other species. Then we have the pickerel frog, which I think this one gets confused a lot with the mink frog. So these ones grow up to 1.5 to 3 inches. They'll hibernate at the bottom of streams and ponds. They can produce a toxin also through their skin that can be fatal to other small animals. And their call sounds like a snore or a mooing cow. So to ID this one, the biggest feature of this one compared to a mink frog, and also gets very confused with a leopard frog. I would say the biggest factor for this guy is that these spots are in 2 neat rows going down the back, or 2 neat lines, sorry, going down the back. A leopard frog is going to have irregular spots, but for the pickerel frog, we have those 2 neat lines. There's also this bright yellow or yellow orange on the inside of the thigh that is distinct. So 2 neat lines. They'll also differentiate from the mink frog. Mink frog also does not have neat lines. Then we have the northern leopard frog. So they can grow up to 4.5 inches. And as I was just saying, they're named after these irregular spots on their skin. So their spots do not go in a neat line. They are all over their body. These ones can hop in a zigzag pattern to avoid predators. I find it quite hard to catch leopard frogs. And their call sounds snore like grunts. I'm pretty sure this is the one I think is a little bit creepy, but So we can also hear in this call, there's peeping in the background. That's not the northern leopard frog. That's a spring peeper. But that deep grunt, snore-like sound, that's the northern leopard frog. So I also just wanted to say that there's a genetic mutation that's come up with some of these frogs where they're blue. So this is a northern leopard frog, so they can have this different coloration. And it's come up a few times. I don't know if anyone has seen these CBC articles, but there's been a few articles about blue frogs in the province, and it's a genetic mutation. There's been a thought like maybe that's a toxin or something's going wrong with these individuals, but it's just a rare mutation. So this occurs in northern leopard frogs, green frogs, and bullfrogs as well. I think this photo was taken from Hyla Park. There's actually been quite a bit of blue frogs in Hyla Park, so they obviously must be mating with one another and keeping that gene strong. Next one I was going to talk about is the American toad. We still have a few more frogs to go, but we're going to go to the toad, the one toad species that we have in the province. So the toads can grow between 2 to 3.5 inches. And as I was saying, these guys are mainly on land. They're not normally going to be near bodies of water. It's the only toad found in eastern Canada, and these ones can secrete a toxin that's a mild poison that can irritate the skin. I've never had problems with it, and I've picked up a lot of toads, but apparently they do secrete that toxin. So for their call, they have a monotone trill and can last up to 30 seconds. Quite high pitched. So for these guys, the biggest indicator here is, well, they're very bumpy, obviously. These guys are very bumpy compared to our frogs. But another key fact is that they have this white line that's going down the middle of their back. No other species have that. And then each of these little brown spots will actually have a few warts within them as well. But they're bumpy. We don't have anything else like that. And we have this white line. Even their like legs, whenever you're walking up to them and they're hopping away from you, I think it's a pretty easy indicator to know what's a toad versus what's a frog. So the next one I have is the green frog. So these ones can grow between 1 to 4 inches. They're very territorial, and males will wrestle over lily pads. They have really powerful back legs, which have made them the fastest amphibian in North America. They hibernate under the water, and their sound sounds like a banjo. So for their coloration, they're called a green frog, but they can be a lot of different colors. As you can see in this photo, they're green, they're brown, they're kind of bronzy colored. And as I was saying earlier, they can also sometimes be blue. They're more so mistaken with a bullfrog. Trying to ID the difference between this species and a bullfrog is the biggest one. The key factors to differentiate the two is that these guys have a small eardrum, so that eardrum here is either around the size of their eye or smaller, whereas a bullfrog is going to have a really large eardrum. And then another factor here is that they have this ridge that goes along their back. It goes halfway down their back, whereas a bullfrog is not going to have any ridges. So those are the two factors there: small eardrum and this ridge that goes halfway down the back. So we can't depend on color. I just want to show you, here's a photo there of a green frog. I think that was Chance Harbor. So next up is the American bullfrog. So these guys mainly live in water. They are the largest frog in North America and can grow up to 7.5 inches. It's been thought, I've gotten many comments before thinking that these guys are not native to the region, but they are. They are meant to be here. They can just be a little bit problematic because they will eat anything that will fit into its mouth, including birds, if they can get their mouth on it. They are sit and wait predator as well. These guys also, I think it takes about 2 years before they become mature. So they're a tadpole for 2, maybe 3 years before they ever become an adult. So it actually takes them a little bit longer than a lot of other species of frog, but they're quite big. So their call sounds like a cow with a cold, or some people say it sounds like juggo rum. So, like I was just saying, the key factors to differentiate a bullfrog from a green frog is that their eardrum is a lot larger than their eye, so quite a bit larger there, and we have no ridges going along the back. Whereas for green frog, there is a ridge. That's the biggest one there. Okay, next we have the wood frog. So these guys can change their color depending on temperature, and color being like they can be really dark brown, this light brown that we have, a little bit lighter white. The key factor for identifying these guys is this mask that's behind their eye. This photo actually looks quite bright, but normally when you see these guys, it's normally very black. It's a very dark color. So that's your biggest distinguisher on what kind of species this is. These guys also are normally not near wet areas. They're kind of more so in the forest. Sometimes it's really hard to find these guys because they camouflage so well with the leaf litter. I normally only see them if they jump. But if you're in a forested area, that's probably where you're going to find a wood frog. So they can grow up to about 3 inches, so they're smaller. And these guys can freeze their bodies during the winter and unthaw in the spring. And they also have this ridge, but your biggest thing here is that they have this black mask. And their sound sounds duck-like. Next up, we have the spring peeper, which has been in a lot of these calls. So these guys are very small, the smallest out of them all. So they grow between 1.5 to 2 inches long. They can be very hard to find and they blend in well. These guys like to be on trees and they have these sticky toe pads on their feet that help them climb. I'm pretty sure that these guys during the day are mostly up in the trees, and then at nighttime they come down to breed in the lakes or wetlands. So harder to find them. I find it's hard to see them at all until the young ones come out, the babies come out in August. Trying to find adults I find is very, very difficult because they normally are like away during the daytime. And even whenever they are calling at night and it's deafening in the spring when they're calling, it's still really hard to find them because they're so small that it's really hard to see where they're at. These guys can be confused with the gray tree frog because the gray tree frog also has these sticky pads and they look similar, but I'll give you a distinguishing feature on how to identify them from one another. So you've already heard their call in some of the other ones, but these guys have this high-pitched peep over and over again, like its name. And I'll play that one. So the distinguishing factor for these guys, so they have these sticky toe pads. No other frog has that besides gray tree frog. But the biggest one for these guys is that they have this X that's on their back. The gray tree frog does not have this same pattern. All spring peepers have this X. It's not unique to each individual. So that really is your biggest feature. And the fact that they're very small. Gray tree frogs are... I have to see what the next slide says, but they're definitely bigger than spring peepers. Spring peepers are a lot smaller than the gray tree frog. And the young ones, when they come out in August, are also so small. So next I have the gray tree frog. So I do see that this pattern might seem like an X, but it's not that complete X that we see here. This is like a skinny X that goes straight across their back. And this one's more like an H. But all of these patterns on the gray tree frog is different to the individual. This is going to change for each individual gray tree frog. It just so happens that that's what this pattern looks like on the back. So, and these gray tree frogs also have these sticky toe pads that you can see here. So I'm pretty sure that's supposed to say 3 to 5 inches in length, not centimeters. They have these large suction toe pads that I just said, and these guys can change color with their background. So this guy here is green. They can be a more grayish color, or they can go like a dark brown, depending on what they're sitting on. And like I just said, they have this unique dorsal pattern. So whenever we were talking about my bio at the very beginning, my 4th year project was how to create a mark and recapture study for gray tree frogs at Hyla Park. And the way that we ended up doing that was actually taking photos of their back, because it's unique to every individual, and deciding if it was trying to look to see if it was a recapture. And what was cool with that too was that there was frogs that we would catch at nighttime that would be on logs or really close to the water, and they would end up being this really dark brown color. And because of that, it was actually really hard to see this pattern. It blended in really well with each individual. And so what we ended up doing was we put it in a light colored container and put a light on the individual for a couple minutes, and the frog would change its color within 5 minutes to a lighter color that was easier to photograph, which was a really cool thing. We actually published a paper on that in July about using that type of information, and we actually had volunteers from Fredericton that caught frogs with us every night to get that, and we had to wait until like 10 o'clock at night before we could do that, because they don't come down until later. And so this guy's call is a short flute trill. And I also just wanted to say a fun fact was that Canada's first amphibian park was actually in New Brunswick, and it was because of the gray tree frog. And it was Hyla Park, which is why we were doing that whole study. And that was because I think it was in I think it was like 1994, 1996, around that time. They conserved Hyla Park because gray tree frogs were there. And at that time, gray tree frogs were thought to be very rare. And so the park was protected for the gray tree frog. Now we know that gray tree frogs are not as rare as we once thought. And they could have been rare because maybe they weren't here, maybe their range has expanded, or just because we weren't looking. As I was saying, we never saw gray tree frogs until they came down at past 10 p.m., a half hour after sunset at least, and you would have to hear them calling before you ever saw them. So that potentially could be one of the reasons, but they are more common now. But still a cool fact that they're there. Okay, so those are all of the frogs. Those are all the amphibians that we have in the province. But I just wanted to show you when they're going to start calling. March is a great time to give this presentation, because soon we'll start to hear them. And I'm not sure what it's like in Miramichi. And I pulled this from a different website, but generally this is when they're going to start calling. So wood frogs and spring peepers are going to be the first ones that start calling. In Fredericton, they normally start in the beginning of April. The first couple weeks of April, they start calling. Then the northern leopard frogs will start calling, normally to mid to late April. The gray tree frogs and the American toads start next. And you can really see the difference. Like at Hyla Park, the spring peepers go in April to like mid-May, and you cannot speak to somebody in that park without having to yell because they are so loud. And then May's over, they stop, and then a week later, the gray tree frogs start. So you can really see that their breeding season starts, it ends, and then the next frog starts its breeding season. So the gray tree frogs in Fredericton normally start around mid-May to late May. And then they go until about the end of June to the first week of July. We also have American toads that start around that same time. And then green frogs and bullfrogs will also start. Green frogs and bullfrogs, you're probably going to hear a little bit potentially earlier, but they're the last ones. So first ones we'll start hearing is the spring peeper and the wood frog. So that is all I had. I just wanted to say for herping this summer, definitely submit any observations you guys see to iNaturalist or to the Atlantic Canada Conservation Data Center. I say that all of these guys are common, except for the four-toed, but that doesn't mean that we actually don't have data gaps. There's quite a bit that we don't know of. We can say they're common, but we might not know where they actually all occur in the province, especially in the northern area of the province. There's a lot of data gaps. And it also would say that for turtles as well. There's a lot of areas where we don't know where that species exists. So submitting everything that you have is always great data for us to have. If you are looking for salamanders and you're flipping up rocks or logs, make sure to replace that habitat, make sure to put it back, and also make sure you don't slam it back down, especially if there was a salamander under there. Do not grab that salamander by the tail because they will drop it. And just note, if you're handling any amphibians, make sure you're not wearing bug spray because, as I was saying, they breathe through their skin. So if you have bug spray on your hands and then you're touching the amphibians, the toxins are being brought into their body. And I also just wanted to say that this photo might not look like any of the frogs I just showed you, but this is a juvenile gray tree frog. So the juvenile gray tree frogs are this bright green. They all are bright green and they camouflage really well. This is on a common milkweed plant. And these guys are very small. They're probably like smaller than a loony. Very hard to find, but they blend in really well on that common milkweed, which at Hyla Park, there's a field right beside Hyla Park that has all of this common milkweed, and I find tons of little baby gray tree frogs. And if you're looking for frogs, like we see all of our adults during the breeding season at the beginning of spring, but in August, that's when you're going to see all of these young toadlets coming out, and you can see them all over again. So that is all I had for today.
Okay, so switch microphones. And, oh, we're already on so long, okay. So, question. I have one.
Okay.
How many species of frogs are there in Hyla Park?
See species of bugs?
The frogs.
Oh, frogs. It's like there's a lot of bugs there. I think there's 6. We don't have mink or pickerel frog, but I'm fairly certain we have all the others. Yes, so I think there's 6, but
What is the provincial distribution of bullfrog?
it's a good question. I would say
I don't think we see them around here. Ian may have.
you don't think you see bullfrog?
I don't think we see them in Miramichi.
The only place I know of for bullfrogs in the Miramichi was Second Fowler Lake. You know, up in the Kennedy Lakes area.
Wow.
I remember paddling up in there when I was in high school, and I was shocked. You know, I almost fell out of the canoe. Saw a tadpole that was 6 inches long, and thought that's different.
Okay, interesting.
Oh,
There, that was right at the end of June or very first of July.
Yeah, Kennedy Lakes biota. I remember one of the researchers had sampled or caught a bullfrog.
Okay, so in the Brunswick Museum biota, also Ian found bullfrogs there as well. Kennedy Lake.
Right, and we have a new herpetologist from the NB Museum, if anyone knew, Greg Jongsma. He's a herpetologist for the province, and he had done actually a lot of work in Africa on frogs, and now that he's working for the museum, he's doing quite a bit of research with amphibians. So he's been going to all of these bio blitzes and documenting frogs and others.
You know, I don't know when the frogs start calling in Miramichi now, but when I was a kid, you know, 1970s, they would start calling just about the 1st of May. So you'd start hearing wood frogs and spring peepers about the 1st of May, and everything else would come along, you know, within about a week. Well, the early ones would come along within a week, and that was the time to go out with flashlights and lanterns and go check some ditches for the salamanders, you know, the spotted and the blue spotted, and occasionally get a newt.
Cool. Yeah, when I look at, I'm just looking at the iNaturalist, like bullfrog distribution, and you're right, like there actually is no observations, but doesn't mean they're not there. You never know.
I had a question about salamanders. So the spots on the salamanders, is that a warning to other animals? Do they have a poison or just say, don't touch me? Like that,
Yeah.
the yellow? And do they
Yeah,
look,
normally,
yeah. Would they look
yeah,
different
keep going.
under UV light? Would animals see them differently maybe than we see them?
It's a good question. I don't know if they would see differently, but yes, I would say that that would be one of the things that they are doing is that coloration is showing that they have a toxin. Like some of those that I was talking about, they did have a slight poison if they were ingested by other animals. So yeah, that definitely is one. I'm not sure though what they would look like for other animals. It's a good question.
I should know that, but salamanders, do they also have kind of like a juvenile tadpole-like phase, or I know the newt does in your diagram, but the salamanders I don't recall.
There are some species that might have that quick one, but I'm just trying to think if any of the ones that we have in the province do. I do not think so. You guys are coming up with some really good questions today. Yes, they do. Yes, sorry. There are some that have like those gills that will have a quick juvenile phase that's in the water. I'm not sure about all of them though. I know some do, but potentially not all of them, but yes.
Uh,
The redback salamanders, they never visit water. They just lay their eggs in rotting wood. And I think
Yeah, it's not all of them.
the four-toed maybe just lay their eggs in the sphagnum moss, I think.
Yeah, the spotted and the northern dusky do have that juvenile phase. But yeah, blue, what you just said, yeah, that and blue spotteds are also those ones are terrestrial.
Gotcha.
Yeah, so some salamanders are quite small, and the larger spotted ones are quite large. What do they eat? I almost assume that it's, they might have different prey because of their size. When you get to that size, I don't know if earthworms are still on the menu, or like vice versa. Maybe the small ones eat something else. I don't know if they all eat worms or.
Yeah, definitely those bigger ones definitely do eat worms and slugs. I would assume they all probably would eat some form of insect if they're not eating just uh, moss or etc. As long as they can fit it in their mouth, they're probably trying to eat those. But yeah, spotted salamanders, they're quite large. They can eat those snails and the earthworms. Like the smaller ones, they would also like northern dusky. They're in those wetter environments where we have like those smaller bugs. But yes, they all will eat some form of insects.
Okay. No. Okay.
The recordings you play of the various frogs seem mostly individuals, but boy, they can make a real chorus. I'm thinking of wood frogs. First time we heard them, we didn't know what they were. We thought they were ducks and we couldn't see them.
Yeah.
And it looked like a wet area too, but they were really making a racket. Amazing. But of course, the spring people.
Yeah. Yeah, they all make a really loud. Like the time I went to saw spring peepers in Hyla Park, like I was just baffled on how loud they were. It was unreal how loud. And it was like, how many are in this park right now? Like it sounds like there's hundreds, if not more than that. But
Ian? Okay.
It brings back memories, in high school, used to go over to Douglas Field, and there were some ditches along the road in Douglas Field that were good for finding frogs and salamanders in the spring. Spent a lot of time in there, and every once in a while, you'd be out doing there, and along would come the local constabulary, and What are you up to? In the middle of the night. Someone phoned in and reported these suspicious guys along the edge of the road.
Yeah,
Must have happened.
that's a big part, isn't it?
Good. That's it.
Yeah, last one. I can get this information elsewhere, but for the frog recordings, do you have a main resource or a website that you use for that?
I forget exactly where I got that one from. There's a site called Frog Watch, and I
Oh,
forget if that's where I pulled it from or not. I thought there was a site that they had all of these calls on it. I can go back and look. I must have made this presentation like 4 years ago. But I think it's a pretty easy find, and I could share that.
Okay, I can find it. So.
But it is nice to have those, like those specific calls, especially because even when you like look it up on YouTube and stuff, you'll get like background noise and not that like one call.
Yes.
Well, some of us use iNaturalist a bit, and some of us more than others. So that's certainly something we can think about this spring and summer.
Mm-hmm.
Any more thoughts, ideas, questions, reminiscing? Any more reminiscing?
It makes me excited for frog season. It's always whenever the fall comes, I'm always thinking like, oh, it's gonna be so long before I hear another frog call or see another frog. So it's nice to know that we're only a month away before the spring peepers start coming.
It would be interesting, when the frogs start calling around Miramichi now, because, as I say, I distinctly remember it happening right around the 1st of May as a kid, but that's 50 years ago. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, with the great tree frog surveys that we had done, I find those vary. Like those vary whenever we go out. The temperature and in the weather has really changed it for us. And there was a year there where we started them in 2018, and it was really easy every single night for us to hear them. We would look at the weather and we'd find them. And then our last year of doing it, I think, was 2021. And we were getting these nights where the temperature was great at 10 p.m. And then within an hour, the temperature had dropped 5 degrees, and all of a sudden the great tree frogs had stopped calling. So it's like them calling is very dependent on weather and what's going on. But I know that the great tree frogs, some years they were coming out like the last week of May, and others weren't coming till the first week of June. So it really depends on what the weather's like.
Oh, Peter, okay.
Frogs?
Frog's legs.
Yeah, frog legs. There's a delicacy.
I've changed. Did you hear that question? Because I've changed the mic.
No.
Eating frogs is the question.
What about it?
Delicacy.
I didn't hear
Frog-
it.
Frog's legs.
I've never had frog legs, if that's what the question was.
Too close to home.
I don't know if that would be regulated or not, you'd assume, but I don't remember, like, and from the hunting point of view, I've never seen or trapping, nothing related to frogs, so I don't know.
You never
No, I don't think
hear.
Be pretty hungry.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I don't think so.
I don't know.
Okay.
Bullfrogs are invasive in British Columbia. And my understanding was they were brought to British Columbia. Someone was breeding them for frogs' legs. But
Oh,
then
interesting.
I suppose the business went belly up and they just let their frogs go. And so now they're a problem.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah, and they can be disruptive, for sure.
Which kind of brings up another question, Shaylyn. Are there any frogs south of us that might move in due to warmer temperatures or?
I haven't heard of any. There's nothing that's been on the radar of anything coming up to my knowledge, but doesn't mean that it wouldn't happen. Feels like bullfrogs right now are actually the biggest problem, even though they're native. But yeah, no, I haven't heard anything for bullfrog. I would be more concerned maybe with diseases, maybe that potentially that's a lot of stuff that happens in the States and Ontario. You hear a lot about diseases among the frog community, so I'd be a little bit more concerned about that potentially coming through, but there hasn't been anything recently that I've heard.
Well, thank you very, very much, Shaylyn. Very interesting and very, very good presentation. Very clear, very easy to follow. Appreciate it very much.
You guys gave me lots of questions to be thinking about for the next presentation. I'll make sure to have those details in the next one I give to whatever Naturalist Club asks.
Okay, great. As you know, I'm recording this, so I'll send you the link probably sometime tomorrow or the next day. So that you can.
Okay.
So very much appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you.
Let's do that again. Hold on.
Oh.
Hold on. Okay, let's do that again. Later, or whatever. Thank you very much.
No problem. Thank you.
Ian, great to have you on.
Yeah, it was great.
Much appreciated. Okay. Good night. Thank you. Yeah, that's it.